Hi, today we're going to be discussing William Wordsworth's poem called Lines. And I would encourage you, if you don't have a copy of the poem in front of you right now, that you would go ahead and pull that out, because it is a rather lengthy poem, and I'll make sure that you can follow along. We're not going to read the entire poem out loud right now. You should have already done that, and you can certainly reread it when we're done with this video. But I am going to delve into several important lines as we go throughout it. We're not only going to analyze it for meaning, but I also want to talk a little bit about how he structures the poem. You might notice that there aren't stanzas in this poem, but there are some very significant indentations that would indicate that Wordsworth is changing or shifting his thought a little bit. And then after we kind of go through the poem, you'll notice my high-tech visual aids behind me. I'm going to just draw a couple of pictures to kind of help us maybe visualize and think about the poem in a different way. So, let's delve right in. If you noticed, the abbreviated title is Lines, but it has a very long subtitle called Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey on Revisiting the Banks of the Wye during a tour July 13th, 1798. Now, sometimes poets will give us very specific times and places where his or her poem is set. We typically, though, expect that from short story writers or novelists. So one of the clues that Wordsworth is giving us to opening up this poem is right there in that really lengthy subtitle, if you will. He's very specific about time and about place. Keep that in mind as we go through this, because those two things are very important to Wordsworth. However, I would argue that the most important part of that subtitle is the word revisiting. This is a poem that is about a lot of things, and one of those things is memory. Another word that I want you to have associated with this poem, something that we can talk about with all the Romantic poets, it's the word imagination. And we'll talk about how Wordsworth maybe uses that concept in a little bit different way than what we might think in terms of somebody using their imagination. So, I'd like to kind of look at the very first, what I would call the stanza, and it runs from line 1 all the way to about line 23 where you see that break. So I want to kind of summarize what I feel like Wordsworth is doing here. The poem starts off, again, giving us kind of a very specific sort of time marker. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with a length of 5 long winters. So Wordsworth sets us up right here at the beginning with the idea that we have a persona, and he is focused right here at the beginning on the passage of time. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself just for a second because I have the right to do that, right? And I want to just kind of clarify. As sophisticated readers of poetry, we always know that the person who wrote the poem, i.e. William Wordsworth, isn't necessarily the persona, the person speaking to us from inside of the poem. However, the Romantic poets really valued individuality, and so sometimes it is difficult to separate the poet, Wordsworth, from the persona, the I that we see in this poem. And so I can pretty much promise you that I'm going to kind of use those two interchangeably and refer to Wordsworth when I'm actually referring to the persona. So here's my disclaimer that I would argue that the persona in this poem is some sort of variation of Wordsworth, so I may just call him Wordsworth. But anyway, let's delve right in. So if you notice, he's in a natural setting. He's in a rural landscape. And what he is setting us up for here in the first stanza is, hey, I'm back in a special place that I haven't been to in about 5 years. And for him, this special place, you could draw it if you wanted to. You look around line 8, throughout of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under the dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, and he goes on and on and on. So he's saying, hey, this spot that I'm talking about, there's a sycamore tree, and I always imagine the poet laying beneath the sycamore tree. He's looking out, goes all the way down to almost the break, describing this place. He kind of imagines some structures, natural structures that might kind of remind him of houses. If you look around line 19, with some uncertain notice as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. So they aren't actual man-made structures, but kind of houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave. Right? So we get this idea this is a place of solitude for him, but it also has the feeling of a shelter. One way, if you found this poem kind of difficult to grasp onto, is imagine kind of a special place that you enjoy spending time in, right? So we're in Texas, so there might be a couple of deer hunters out there, and I know folks who deer hunt. There's something special about being in the deer blind in the freezing weather with a steaming mug of coffee, just being alone in the quiet. When you know that the deer may not come by the feeder for 2-3 hours. I'm not really a deer hunter, but I do love to fish, and one of my favorite spots in the entire world is in Giddings, Texas, at a little stock tank that my wife's grandparents used to own. But just a place that I've gone to throughout my lifetime, and it's a place, at least for me, that I enjoy the solitude. Take just a couple of seconds and think about what's your special place. You might not be into being outside, so it might be a room in your house or your apartment. You may feel most comfortable in a special place with a group of people. It might be a favorite store, a coffee shop, whatever it is where you like to go to kind of leave the rest of the world behind. So kind of think about that as we work our way through the rest of the poem. So he describes his special place, if you will, in that first section. And then he begins to go a little bit deeper and explain, starting around line 23, where we see that first kind of big break, what it is about this place that makes it special for him. Because it is indeed about getting away from the rest of the world, but he uses this place in a very specific way. I'm just going to read about line 23 through 30. These beauteous forms, the landscape that he just described to us, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but often lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities. I have owned them. So for me, this is where the poem really gets interesting, because he says, hey, I don't just forget about this place when I'm not here. I have spent time thinking about this place, and I have been able to return to this place when I'm away from it. So think about this. It is about memory, but I would maybe use the phrase intentional memory. And in order to have an intentional memory, you need to be wholly physically, mentally, spiritually present when you're in that place. So imagine using all 5 senses when you're in your special place, so that you kind of ingrain in your memory the sound of lizards crawling through dead leaves. You can hear the sounds of birds chirping. You can feel the wind on your skin. You can smell pine needles. So this is a poem not only about the past and memory, but also something that the persona of the poem says, in order to be able to draw up on those memories, if you're in a special place in the present, you need to be wholly physically aware and alert so that you can return to that place in your mind. So pretty interesting. And that last little phrase that I read, I have owned them. Think about what that means. What does it mean to own a place? He's pretty serious about this. He goes on through the rest of that section all the way to about line 50, kind of elaborating upon that idea. One of the interesting things that he does to emphasize how special this, not only the place is, but also the way he uses the place, around line 37, 38 there. He says something about of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. So he does some nice things with imagery there. You come into this place either physically in the present, or if you're no longer physically in that place, but you're drawing upon it in your memory, and the weight of the world becomes lightened, right? It kind of goes away, it evaporates because of your association with that place. The third section is a little bit the briefest section in the entire poem, and I'd like to go ahead and read all of that starting around line 51. If this be but a vain belief, it's like, okay, you might think I'm crazy. I just laid out a philosophy in the first and second stanzas, if you will. I think it's true, but if I'm wrong about the power of this place, yet oh, how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless delight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, thou wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee. So really he's saying, you might think that this idea is strange and bizarre, but I'm here to tell you that it works for me, right? So many times in my life I have drawn back upon this power of being intentionally present, and then also drawing upon those memories, and it has given me great comfort and joy and bliss. The example I like to use is, we've asked you to think about being in a special place. Now think about being in a place that you'd rather not be. For me, that is probably in the dentist chair, right? Especially if you're having some intensive work done and the dental assistant has her hands stuffed into your mouth with a drill and your throat is beginning to fill up, and she's asking you questions that she knows you can't answer because your mouth is full. It seems sort of diabolical to me. And there's the weird smell of the dentist office. At those moments when you'd kind of like not to be where you are, you don't really want to be physically, wholly, spiritually present, then you can kind of disappear in your mind to that place. Now we all do that, don't we? Right? We all daydream. But I want you to keep in mind that Wordsworth is suggesting very intentional daydreaming, right? So that if you have that place locked in your head so clearly that you can really make the present disappear if you'd like. You're back in that special place in the woods or the coffee shop or whatever it is that your special place is. Let's look at the next section. And this one gives folks sometimes a little bit more of a challenge to work their way through. Starting around line 60. And I'm just going to summarize it. I don't think there's any lines that I especially want to highlight, but just kind of give you a summary. Because Wordsworth is always kind of moving through time and space in this poem. And so he reminds us, after he's gone through describing his special place, that he's back in after a 5-year absence, what the place means to him and how he uses it. In this particular stanza, he says, hey, when I was younger, I didn't really understand this philosophy, or I didn't have this philosophy. So I was in this place sometimes when I was younger, but it was a different kind of experience. And at one point he says it was often like I was being chased rather than I was chasing after something. And so I think, you know, he might be middle-aged or older, and maybe a little bit of commentary here on how sometimes youth is wasted on the young, as they say. He just kind of enjoyed it. He was just there. And I might be reading a little bit more into it, but he might be suggesting, hey, sometimes when we're younger, and this isn't true for everyone, I understand that, it's a little bit more of a carefree time. We can just kind of let life happen, but that he's needed to turn this special place into something different as life becomes more difficult, as he needs some sort of temporary escape. I'm going to move on then, in the interest of time, and look at the last two sections. I am looking at line 113. We've talked a couple of times about a turn in a poem, and certainly he gives us slightly different things to think about with each stanza. I would argue in this fifth and final stanza here is where he makes a turn, because thus far it's just been the persona alone, and in a lot of ways celebrating being alone. Part of what makes his special place special is that it's just him. In this fifth stanza, you may have noticed, I'll just start from the beginning. Line 114. Nor perchance, if I were not thus taught, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay. For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend. And then he goes on and keeps celebrating how special this friend is to him. And then we realize in line 24, his dear friend is also his dear, dear sister. Now, if you wanted to do a biographical reading, Wordsworth did have a sister named Dorothy, and they had a really close relationship. But if we want to kind of divorce Wordsworth from the poem and just look at the persona, this persona is specifically identifying the friend as his or her sister. Now, here's where the poem, for me, gets really cool. It is one thing to have maybe a far-out, slightly bizarre philosophy about life and what you can do with the specialness of place. And here in this fifth stanza, he expresses to his sister that he admires her so much, that he values the relationship so much, that he wants her to adopt the same philosophy that he has, and for a very specific reason. He says, let's go down here. I'm going to skip to 142, and I apologize, but I'm going to read the rest of the poem from 142 to the end, and then go back and summarize what I think he's doing. So he's saying, hey sister, let me explain to you this philosophy that I have, and now the two of us are here together, and I want you to lock this moment in your mind so that it shall be a mansion for all lovely forms. Thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Oh, and then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me and these my exhortations. Okay, actually I'm going to pause there. So did you get what he's saying there? He's saying, hey, lock this in your head. Make it as clear so that it's a mansion in your head, right? And if some point you experience loneliness, fear, depression, you can draw upon not only this place, but our time together in this place, right? You can specifically remember me, right? And our relationship. Now, I would argue that the next line, when he says, nor perchance if I should be where I no more can hear, right? So he's saying you can use this, sister, as a way to kind of comfort yourself and bring you joy, but he really wants to be locked in her memory. And so when he says, when you can no longer hear me, that might just be a physical separation. It could also mean if I die before you do, and there's no longer any sort of possibility of us being together in this place, let alone any other physical space, then this memory will be even a more precious kind of sanctuary for you to return to. And then, in case you haven't figured it out by now with any experience you might have had with Wordsworth or this poem, in 155 he says, so long a worshipper of nature, himself, and then he really goes on for the rest of the poem, continuing to encourage his sister to embrace this idea, and then he says, you know, it'll be for thy sake, right? And so hoping something good for his sister. So to kind of recap, obviously, hopefully we got the idea of it's locked in his mind, this special place, being physically present when you locate a special place so that you can recreate it in your mind. And then also, again, what I think is really interesting about this poem, trying to share that with someone else, right? So he goes from, hey, go through a really intense mental exercise by yourself, but then also engage with someone else in that mental exercise. What I want to wrap up with then, and this will be a little bit messy, but I really like to kind of draw out some elements of this poem, because thus far, as we've moved through this, it kind of seems like a linear idea, right? That you have something in the past, you draw upon it in the present, and then you can use it in the future. I would argue that Wordsworth's doing something even a little bit more complicated than that. And I'm going to move to our fancy little whiteboard here. So when the poem begins, right, he says, this is a place where I was 5 years ago in the past. Okay, I just want to make sure. That might show up, hopefully. So this is 5 years ago in the past. When he's speaking to us in the poem, he is in the present. And he tells us what this place looks like in the present. Remember, he's got the sycamore tree, if you will, and he's kicked back underneath it, and all the things that he sees down here. He returns to the past in the midst of the poem, right? When he says, hey, when I was younger, maybe even longer than 5 years ago, this is how I experienced this place. This is what the place means to me now. And then at some point he brings in his sister, right? So his sister's there with him. Sometimes you have to be stereotypical and gender specific when you're doing stick figures, so his sister has a dress in this illustration. And then, right, then he reminds us that really why he's so worked up about this whole idea is that so you can use it in the future, right? He studied this place 5 years ago, and now he's in the future, right? And it's special to him. And then the memories that he's making with his sister in this place at this point is something that he's encouraging her, right? At some point in the future, if the both of them are separated, either by death or just some sort of other physical separation, they can use this experience in the future, and so on. Again, it looks very linear, but I would argue that part of what Wordsworth is doing in this poem is really kind of making an argument that all of these things can collapse. That the past and the present and the future, if you're intentional about your thought and your experience, really you experience all of them at one time. That there really isn't a delineation in time, right? That it all, if you do this mental exercise correctly, right? If you remember the breeze blowing on your face, the conversation maybe that you're having with another person, the sounds that you're hearing, the smells that you're smelling, that it never really leaves you. That we experience the past, the present, and the future all at one time. There might be a few things that I didn't cover in this poem that you had questions about. Email me. There may be things that you have, brilliant ideas, observations. So I would encourage you to reread the poem, maybe even reread it in a special place and ponder what it is that Wordsworth is encouraging us to think about. Thanks.